So what we're going to be looking at in a second is from one of my favorite rabbis. He's a go-to in the sense that he is, his Hebrew is exceedingly easy to follow. He uses really simple Hebrew. And I knew that that was good because I had about 5 other things to do today at work. And so having a really difficult thing to translate was not high on my list. So this is our friend Levi Yitzhak of Berdichev. Berdichev is in the far west of what we call today Ukraine. Levi Yitzhak, I think, died in around 1827, something like that. So he is considered one of the earlier Hasidic masters. We're going to be doing 2 texts by him. One is a fun one about what it means to dress up and what Adar means. And the second one is a little bit more intricate and serious and gets into some of the rabbinic issues around the Book of Esther, which I'll save until we get there. So it should be posted on your screen right now, and you should be able to see it quite nicely. All right. With that, rarely we are starting right with a Hasidic text as opposed to a piece of the Bible, because there is no Torah portion to comment on. The line that he's going to be commenting on is right in there. So I will read the Hebrew at just the first 3 lines so we can get a flavor of it. And then Rana, if you don't mind, unless you're talking to Dan and Dan's going to make a lot of noise in the background, I'm going to have Rana read. She's good to read. Excellent. I made fun of you earlier, so now I give you the kavod of letting you read. Leva er ma'amar chachamenu zichronam livracha in Ta'anit 29. Mi shenichnas hadar marbim b'simcha. Ki ikar hasimcha la'adam v'ha'aloto hanitzutzot la'avodato yitbarach shehanitzutzot na'asim la'adam shemala otam kamo lavush. All right, Rana, you take it from there.
When one enters Adar, merriment increases. For the main thing about joy for humans is, in the rising up of the sparks in the service of the Blessed One, that the sparks were made for humans such that in elevating them, they are like a garment. And this is how the joy takes place. And before Adar, it is mischievously rascally to be excessively joyous, but Adar is the time to take the sparks up to become holy. And when Adar...
Stop there. We'll explain that. Good job, Rana. Well read. And Rana read it so well that she corrected a grammatical error I made in translating. So good job, Rana. So there is a famous line in Ta'anit, which has become a song that we sing at Purim. Misha nichnas Adar marbim besimcha, right? It's been put to the tune of, and it was one of the only songs that I could play on my guitar as a rabbi at Purim, because it only has 2 chords, and the chord change basically is put your finger on, put your finger off, put your finger on, put your finger off. And as a rabbi, I can't play my guitar and sing at the same time. And the song was originally a TV commercial in Israel in the 1970s. It was Artik menta chocolate banana, Artik menta chocolate limon, Artik menta chocolate banana, which means popsicle, mint, chocolate, banana, popsicle, mint, chocolate, lemon, right? And that was the whole song. And then they go, whoa, chocolate banana, whoa, chocolate lemon. So in this, the rabbis of the starting in the 1980s, put the Misha Nichnas Adar to that tune. Misha Nichnas Adar. Marbim besimcha.
That was a song here when we were growing up.
Yeah.
Yeah,
no.
Jump down, turn around, kick a bell.
That's right. They stole the tune from, but in Israel, they stole the tune from a TV commercial. So Paula was saying that it's jump down, turn around, pick a bale of cotton, jump down, turn around, pick a bale of hay, which I had completely forgotten, by the way, completely forgot because the context was lost. By the way, many children have their minds blown. I think my mind was blown in my 20s when I realized that Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star and A, B, C, D, E, F, G were the same music, right?
There's a whole bunch of them.
There's a lot of those, right? There's a lot of those where they steal the song and reuse it frequently. Israelis would be shocked to find out that Artik Menta Chocolate Banana was stolen from an 1800s old kind of slave style tune. I think that song is originally
Probably not allowed to sing it
a
anymore.
minstrel tune, right? It's a 1920s minstrel tune of songs that white people invented for performances to make it seem like Black people who were performing slave work were enjoying it while they were doing it. But just because that's the origin of that tune doesn't mean we should stop singing Misha Nichnas Adar. We have elevated it. All right, back to the text. So when one enters Adar, merriment increases. So Adar is the month in which Purim falls. Purim falls on the 15th of Adar. In a leap year, Purim falls on the 15th of Adar Bet. So we are 45 days into the month of Adar, and we were supposed to increase our merriment, right? Now, when a Hasidic rabbi gets a statement like this in the Gemara, he has at least two things to kind of comment on. Thing one is really simple. Yeah, why, right? Like, why would joy increase because of Adar? Another way of framing that is to ask the question, does the chicken come first or the egg, right? And by that, I mean, does Adar inherently create joy, or do we bring the joy into Adar? Okay, so that's an interesting question to ask, right? Like, am I supposed to be happier and act happier, or is it psychoeffective to me, right? Like, I walk into Adar and I'm like, something's different, something magical happened. It's the first of Adar. I'm happier now, right? Like, does it happen to me? Does it happen whether I want to do anything about it or not? And another way of asking this, which we're going to kind of get into, and that's the core of this text is, and I think it's very Hasidic, right? Actually, this is on some level the most Hasidic text we've ever done, in the sense that it is asking questions about emotions, right? How does Torah command emotions, which is the thing we talk about in this class a lot. And what's really Hasidic is the Hasidim are often kind of thought of as the people who brought joy to Judaism. So the question then becomes, what is holy about joy and happiness, right? Why is happiness a holy act? Because how can you say that emotions carry different levels of holiness, right? If I'm afraid, is that less holy than if I'm happy? If I'm sad, is that less holy than if I'm happy, right? Isn't the human experience a holy experience regardless of the emotions we bring to the experience? So the way he frames it is beautiful, and it's nothing that we haven't seen before. In fact, it's a concept that in this class I feel like we've tread over frequently in the last couple weeks, which is, he says, in the joy for humans is in raising up the sparks in the service of the Blessed One. Okay, that's beha'aloto ha-nitzutzot. So nitzutzot are shards, fragments, sparks, light, right? And again, we're playing with this imagery that Kabbalah plays with all the time, that God sends Shefa down into the universe, and humans elevate nitzutzot, the divine shards of light, through tikkun olam, through prayer, through holiness, through service. We send light up to God by redeeming the sparks, right? By raising up the sparks, which is often referred to, especially in the Reform movement, as tikkun olam. But in the Kabbalistic world, tikkun olam is not just helping old ladies cross the street or sending money to refugees in Ukraine. It is all manner of things are tikkun olam, right? Putting on your tefillin in the morning are tikkun olam. Coming to morning minyan and being number 10, tikkun olam, right? Setting the world right and doing what is holy and sacred in the service of God is tikkun olam in this broader concept. All right, go ahead, Tanya. And then Rich. Can't hear you.
Okay, I actually have two questions. The Torah is actually silent on this, but you remember in the beginning when God created everything, the heaven and the earth, and the pronouncement was it was good. Okay, it doesn't say that it sparked joy, but I wonder if we can imagine that God felt some sense of pleasure after seeing creation, especially after he created man. And, you kind of get a little hint of that joy after Adam had fallen asleep and he woke up and there was Eve, he said, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. And I know this is a lot of conjecture here, but I do wonder if actually creating the world sparked joy with God.
Yeah.
And then my second question is, and this is a little off the subject, you were talking about Purim and getting dressed up. Well, I just finished, I have to write a drash for Zav on Friday night. And I was just wondering if there was a connection for dressing up for Purim and dressing up the high priest, because a lot is spent on the high priest's clothing in this parashah.
So I'll answer the second part first. The only connection, the main connection between Purim and the high priest revolves around the fact, in my opinion, they're the only one that I know of, is that the high priest's most important day is Yom Kippur, right? It's the only day that they enter the Kodesh Kodashim, the Holy of Holies. And one of the fun things that our rabbis do in lots of our texts is point out that we call that day Yom HaKippurim, which translates as the day which is like Purim. So the rabbis have lots and lots of fun comparing Yom Kippur and Purim, because the word Purim is baked in to Kippurim, right? So they have a lot of nice parallels. You dress up in this to create a state of holiness. They are days in which, in many traditions, they're both joyous, right? Purim is one that is joyous because the Jews were saved. Yom HaKippurim is joyous because it's the day in which we are forgiven. And the vessel of our forgiveness is the high priest. So I think the dressing up and the high priest and the forgiveness and the being saved, all those things would fit neatly into a nice box for a drash for you, Tanya. The first question you asked was, I'm not going to spend too much time on because I spent so much time answering the second one, but I think you do a nice job there, Tanya, of bringing together the idea of goodness and the idea of joy. And I wouldn't say they're synonymous, but I definitely think that they're worthy of linking in a larger context. Well done. All right, Rich, you wanted to say something.
Yes, I want to bring a practical aspect to it. Not that you've not been practical, but bringing joy is very important to retaining adherence to the religion, or any enterprise for that matter, to have some joy in it. At least in my opinion it is. I suppose there are some that are not joyful at all and have adherence, but it's important and people want it, and it's a beautiful thing. And so that, I'm just raising the point that it's a practical matter as well as an inspirational matter to be joyful.
Yeah, I think that's really important to remember, that the holiday, practically speaking, and the religion, practically speaking, need to be joyous, because a religion that was, and it's nice, it's kind of referencing the idea of balance, a religion that was solely penitential and based in that which we do wrong and our need to set it right is not a great thing. It would not be very fun if the religion were kind of predicated on being miserable and apologetic.
Life wouldn't be fun if we didn't
Right.
have joy. Life itself is joy.
Right.
You need to have both to balance.
Right.
You can't experience joy if you've never had sorrow.
Right.
Vice versa.
Right. And Judaism does a nice job of revolving that throughout the calendar. I mean, I think a lot of families, if you ask your average Jewish person, what's important to you about Judaism, they'd say, oh, the food at this holiday dinner that I used to go to my boobies for. And the reason that we have those holiday meals is because we want to experience the joy that comes with the holiday. That being said, the most popular holiday in Judaism for people to attend synagogue is Yom Kippur, which is on some level the most serious, the most solemn, the most intense, the most sad. There's literally no eating on that day, right? We need them both. Okay, Tanya, did you want to say something else, or?
No, I'm sorry. I forgot
Cool.
to lower my hand.
No, you're good. So the rest of the text says something really lovely, and it's playing with the theme of Purim a little bit. It says, the sparks were made for humans such that in elevating them, they are like a garment, right? It's malbush. It's a thing that you wear. And this is how the joy takes place, right? So joy is a thing you put on like a robe. And then he says, and before Adar, it is shovavim. And it's a very strange use of the word, but to be a shovav is like in modern Hebrew, a shovav is a troublemaker, right? And I thought the word mischievous was a really good one, but I had to use the word rascally because it appeared as one of the thesaurus words when looking up shovav. But a shovav is in modern Hebrew, it's a troublemaker. The idea of being excessively joyful in a foolish or clownish kind of way, the way we are kind of trained to do so on Purim, the other 11 months of the year in the rabbinic tradition, that is viewed as not a good thing, right? There is a time to be straight and serious, and there's a time to be silly. And I think the interesting thing is that the rabbis fully recognize that narishkeit can be holy, that silliness and foolishness can be holy if you elevate it. They're not, I would argue here, the way I understand it, they're not arguing that narishkeit and silliness and foolishness is bad the rest of the year, because he doesn't use the word ra. He says it's mischievous or that it's rascally, right? Like, you know, you go to see a silly movie and it's a silly movie, but you probably don't want to go and see a silly movie on Yom Kippur. You don't want to say, and here's the really big point, right? You see a really ridiculous, you know, fart joke comedy. The rest of the year, if you see it, you might enjoy it, but you probably would have a hard time making an argument that it was holy, right? For the Kedushat Levi and for the rabbis, Purim, as ridiculous and inappropriate as it ever gets, is holy. And that's a conundrum for the rabbis, because that which was holy the rest of the year, or not holy the rest of the year, becomes holy on this day. And it's really different. And his framing of it is, there's nothing special about doing it on, you know, in the month of Av. But if you do it in the month of Adar, it's the time to take up the sparks and become holy. Go ahead, Marilyn.
Well, I had more of a question, and that is that that something's bothering me about this dichotomy, and that is that when I go to shul, you know, and I agree with Rich on this, I feel joy. You know, there are moments in the prayers where I simply feel joy, yeah, as especially when we're all participating, and so yes, there's a certain silliness to dressing up on Purim, but at the core of Purim is a very solemn and serious center, in that they were going to exterminate the Jews, you know, and Esther, despite her concerns, stepped up for it. And so there's a not silly element there. So I don't see that there's this dichotomy that on Purim it's all silly, but on a normal Shabbat or even on any, you know, morning or evening minyan, that there wouldn't be that moment of joy. Right. Perhaps not silliness, although sometimes I think it's silly when somebody says, oh, I tried this to a different tune and it's really cool. Yeah. And it's interesting, but it isn't always cool to everybody in shul. But nevertheless, there's joy and occasionally a little silliness. Yeah.
I think that's beautiful, and I agree wholeheartedly. And it's very Hasidic, Maryland, in the sense that one of the more famous quotes of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov was, and we sing this as a song too, which is I'm stuck. I got the other song stuck in my head, so I have to trying to push it out, which is mitzvah gedola liot b'simcha tamid. Mitzvah gedola liot b'simcha tamid. Mitzvah gedola liot b'simcha tamid. By the way, now that I'm thinking about it, one of the challenges that I've had as a rabbi is I don't have a big musical Rolodex. I don't have a lot of songs. I'm musical enough. I can carry a tune, but I'm not particularly musically inclined. And my rabbi who taught me, and basically is the basis for this class, Reb Mimi Feigelson, she would start every Hassidut class that we ever had with nigunim. And I feel like I'm pressed for time, and also that's not really naturally my way. Paula said, "Thank God."
I don't like everything starting with nigunim.
No, I know.
They sound like funeral music
Right.
to me.
And I
don't like it.
right. Paula
Wrong
feels,
frame of mind.
yeah. For me, you come for a thing, you get the thing, you leave. You know, you don't. If some people might like the nigunim, but they probably didn't come for the nigunim. So I don't know. Anyways,
And I don't care if you tell Rabbi Adelson that or not.
oh, don't
I
worry.
like them.
He's
I haven't liked them since day one.
he's mostly with you. So everybody's a little bit different. But mitzvah gedola leo b'simcha tamid translates, before I forget, Marilyn, as it is a great mitzvah to be joyous always, which was ironic because Rabbi Nachman was very manic depressive in his temperament. He was very, it was the nigudim, says Paula. It's a Purim spiel already. We're having Purim.
I don't need a costume.
No, it's ironic, and it's probably hard to fully understand because he was a depressive individual, and he would say it's a mitzvah to be joyous. And there's a lovely text that I've taught you guys all before, you folks all before, which is it's a great mitzvah to be to find joy in the sadness, right? But I think what you said, Marilyn, is beautiful, that finding simcha in things other than the month of Adar is also valid. And I think that that's holy too. Well said. All right, let's keep going. Rich, will you mind reading all the way to the bottom? So there's 2 paragraphs. And when Adar arrives, we elevate, and then that's when it says we enter Adar.
And when Adar arrives, we elevate that which was mischief, and we wear it like a coat. And that's why we call it Adar, for it uses the language of getting dressed up. Like when we say Aderet Eliyahu, the cloak of Elijah. That's why it says we enter or get into Adar. When one themselves gets into the dressing of the holy sparks that are raised up from mischief, one increases joy, for it is a great joy to raise them up.
Great. So what the rabbi did really neatly, and this is why this is a lovely short teaching, is he took the famous phrase, Misha Nichnas Adar Marbim L'Simcha, like, why is Adar a special month where we're more joyous, right? Why the whole month? And then he finds the holiness in that by kind of talking about how joy, and somebody here said spark joy. And the funny thing is, we all know that that's Marie Kondo's kind of addition in this whole things of like, she said that she's the woman who's, I think, on some TV show of like, now she's on a TV show, but I think she started as kind of like an interior designer who wrote books. Who said, like, if an object doesn't spark joy, you should get rid of it, right? Like you don't need crap around your house cluttering things up. Have a nice, neat house, but don't get rid of everything. Keep the things that are funny. And the phrase that she used was spark joy. And the irony is that that phrase appears in this text, which predates Marie Kondo by about 150, 180 years, right? Sparks of joy. And how do we make sparks of joy? We wear it like a coat. And he's clearly punning on the idea of getting dressed up for Purim, right? That you wear, and back in the old days, they probably just wore masks, and the kids would dress like Haman. And like Rana was saying, they would dress like Haman, and they would dress like, and today you can dress like however you want. You can wear anything that would be fun for kids. But Rana, when I was a kid, there was also a strong sense that you're supposed to dress up as one of the characters from the story specifically. So I don't know how the worm turned, except that we as an American Jewish community decided that we wanted to make Purim a really fun holiday and accessible to all. And there are only so many times a kid can dress like King Ahazeras and feel like this is really special. Also, between King Ahazeras and Iron Man is a cooler costume.
So people have the costumes and you want to recycle.
That's right.
Halloween costumes.
Right. Paula said you can recycle your Halloween costume, right? My family, kids like dressing up, and so we do. They get one new costume for each of the holidays, and they love it. And now that my kids are getting to the age where they're starting to kind of think that dressing up is too cool and it's for little kids, I'm definitely enjoying the fact that they're still into it, because we're going to pass out of that phase of dressing up soon, and I will be sad. Maybe not. Hopefully they'll do it like I do every year. Okay, so we have this really lovely line where it says you get dressed up, and the dressing up creates holiness, which elevates mischief and turns it into like a thing that you wear that elevates the the sparks. And he uses, again, kind of a biblical pun. He says, like we say, Aderet Eliyahu, the cloak of Elijah. There's this line in 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 13, in which Elisha, the servant of the scion of Elijah, is following him around. And it says down below, he took up the mantle of Elijah that fell from him and went back and stood by the bank of the Jordan. And basically the word, the Hebrew word for cloak, for mantle, is aderet. And it's a unique word. It doesn't appear frequently in the Tanakh. And the question is, what's up with that? And the answer is aderet is like the Hebrew word Adar, right? So Adar is the month of dressing up. And it says so right in the Tanakh, right? That's the fun little pun that they make, right? And what is special about this? Well, there's the holiness of joy, which comes with Adar. And the holiness of joy includes the dressing up, right? And you wear it like a cloak. So you raise up the sparks by doing mitzvot, by being joyful, and you put them on. You're in the lavush of the nitzutzot. You are wearing the holy sparks, which is this really lovely Kabbalistic idea and Hasidic idea. Your Purim costume is holy, right? This is the holy sparks of God, right? When I throw on my Star Trek uniform later on this evening, I am dressed in holiness, right? According to the Kedushat Levi, it is as if I was in talis and tefillin, right? It is equal to talis and tefillin for this 25-hour period, which is really lovely. Paula says that she's just going to put on talis and tefillin tonight instead.
Except that I wouldn't know how to put on tefillin.
Oh, we'll
I
fake
never had
it till you make it. You'll be okay. Final paragraph says, and when we enter into Adar, and this is him riffing off of the word Misha Nichnas. Nichnas means to enter, right? But it's very physical. And you don't enter into a month in a physical way like you walk through the door or when you put on a costume. But that's his pun. When one gets themselves into the dressing of the holy sparks, one raises joy because it's a great joy to raise them up. So he's just kind of wrapping the idea together that you wear holiness by wearing simcha, and you wear simcha by putting on a costume. And I love this teaching. It's really cute and simple and straightforward. The next teaching is going to get into it a little bit deeper. And for those of you who are going to be hearing the Megillah tonight or tomorrow, this year more than most years, I don't know why, every year I struggle with the Megillah. To Marilyn's point before, it's the only text in Judaism where we have a fun, silly holiday with triangle-shaped cookies and dancing and singing and playing and having a good old time. And the book, if you've read it enough times with as much rabbinic exegesis and as much deep introspection as I have, you have to kind of either read past or not read past the misogyny, the sexual assault, the sexual exploitation, the enslavement, and the genocide, not to mention the capital punishment of Haman, his wife, and their 10 sons, right? It's not a book for children, right? It is not a fun, lighthearted romp. It is treated by our tradition as a lighthearted romp, as a farce. And a lot of people definitely think that it is, there are those scholars who have argued for years, like, the Purim story has no factual historical evidence of ever having happened. And if that's the case, then it can be a lighthearted romp, right? It's a Marvel movie. This didn't really actually happen. Downtown Manhattan was not destroyed by space aliens, and we didn't have to be saved by Captain America. So we can have fun with it, and we can tell jokes, and we can do, silly things and so on. But the text is rough. If you read through every line, there's some bad stuff in it. And I got into an argument over the last 48 hours online with an Orthodox woman who really didn't like the modern liberal Jewish recasting of Vashti in a positive light. And we're going to address that very briefly in this text. But like the rabbis of the medieval period, they took the story, which is very much like all other biblical stories, which is full of complexity, and they whitewash it, they simplify it, and they put all the Jews in white hats and they put all the non-Jews in black hats, right? The non-Jews become all villains and the Jews become heroic. And it's more complicated than that, right? And it's a sloppy, messy, funky story that's not easy to read. The experience of Purim is not the same as the text of Purim that we read, because the two of them are very different. Some years I have less trouble with this, and some years I have more trouble with it. This Hasidic teaching that we're about to do is really nice because it does the classic Hasidic read of unbounding the text from its deep, potentially troublesome, difficult stuff and spinning it in a different direction. Now, that being said, I'll give you a warning. It's not totally clean, because Rabbi Levi Yitzhak of Berdichev is still going to rely on the rabbinic exegesis, which still paints the Jews as good and the non-Jews as bad. But there is a nice little spin here that gives us a little bit of introspection and clarity as to a question that I come up with a lot in kind of the moral universe of talking about Purim, which is, we talk about, there's no arguing it. Haman's the villain, right? Haman, boo, is the bad guy, okay? But one of those interesting questions that comes up every year is, so is Achashverosh any better, right? And what do we do with Achashverosh? How are we supposed to understand him? And there are lots of arguments. And the rabbinic argument that we're going to come in contact with today is a really interesting one that you should all be aware of. And I'm glad that our Hasidic rabbi brought it, because it's kind of neat. All right, with that, do you think, D, you'd be okay with reading the English and what I'll call the first paragraph before I jump, where it says, who is he and how dare he? I'll read the Hebrew of the first line and then you'll take it from there. Okay, D? Vayomer hamelech Achashverosh, Vayomer leEsther hamalka, mihu ze ve'ezehu, asher mal'o libo la'asot ken.
Thereupon King Ahasuerus demanded of Queen Esther, who is he and where is he who dared to do this?
Great. You may not be able to hear it very well, but she read that top line. All right, read the next paragraph down to, who is he and how dare he?
The words of our rabbis, why is this Vayomer here 2 times? The Ahazeras, Rabbi Isaac Luria, one must receive this Rav on holidays and Shabbat. For when they look upon their Rav, they gain clarity. For looking at the righteous person causes a person holiness. And Ahasuerus spoke well here for Israel in saying, who is he and how dare he?
Okay, so we start off with a classic rabbinic problem, a really simple rabbinic problem. And the translation doesn't do it full justice. The Hebrew says, Vayomer hamelech Achashverosh, and then it says, Vayomer leEsther, right? And it's redundant and it doesn't make any sense. A direct literal translation would be, and the king Ahasuerus said, and he said to Esther, right? The translation doesn't reflect the fact that the word and he said appears twice, and one of them is like more than superfluous and redundant. Usually when we do Bible and I say something is superfluous and redundant, I generally mean that it is like a necessary, but it has a logical linguistic reason for existing. This one doesn't even have a logical linguistic reason for existing. It just looks like a typo, right? It just looks like the word and he said is written twice and there's no reason for it. So, but of course this is Holy Writ and therefore there must be a reason for it. So the Arizal is Rabbi Isaac Luria. He's a guy who we haven't come into contact with very often, but in the Kabbalistic world, he's the most important rabbi of all time. There's only one other rabbi who's anywhere near him in Kabbalah, and that is Moshe de Leon. And de Leon doesn't get the credit that the Arizal does, because the Arizal, all of his words were purportedly his own words, right? It was his Kabbalah that he was doing. Moshe de Leon said, oh, I found this book and it belonged to Shimon Bar Yochai. He didn't purport to actually have written any of his own words. He ascribed them to somebody else. So even though Moshe de Leon is the most important Kabbalist of all time, he himself would say, I am not the most important Kabbalist of all time. And later, in about 200 years later, the Arizal, who lived in Sfat, Rabbi Isaac Luria would come, right? Isaac Luria is the guy who created the Kabbalat Shabbat service that we all know and love today. Without Isaac Luria, there is no Kabbalat Shabbat. We go to Friday night services and it looks exactly the same as Thursday night services, Wednesday night services, and Tuesday night services. So for those of you who like a quick 9-minute Mariv, you have Isaac Luria to blame for why it's now 45 minutes, right? With a lot of singing and a rabbi sermon. But he has this really interesting quote, and his interesting quote is a non sequitur that's not directly related to this line, but we'll get to why it is this way, which is that when you see your rabbi, you're supposed to go to your rabbi on holidays and Shabbat. And it says that, like, when you see them, you gain clarity, right? That you are, what's the ki al yadei mistakel barabo nitz osef lo bebihirut. You kind of, you stand in the bright light of your rabbi. Now, there's a problem with this text that I feel like Marilyn and I both would have, which is this phrase implies a certain amount of Rebbe worship, right? A certain amount of come and sit by the feet of the beatific rabbi who will, and just being in his presence or her presence will make your life better. And there's a certain amount of cultish weirdness that I don't like in this either. And it's actually very counter to what the Kedushat Levi normally does. So I will say, just hit pause because he's going to do interesting things after this. I would not have brought you this text if it was not just to apply that Dee should come to my office once a week and bring me Haman Tashin and sit at my feet and bask in my amazing, glorious glow, right? Like, I have a giant ego, but it ain't that big, right? I don't think my ego should be so big that people should literally bask in my presence and become better human beings just by sitting in my light. But you're going to see, Marilyn, where this goes. And I will say, to kind of defend the other point, Paula made a comment before about someone who they know who, maybe it was Dee who told the story of someone was sitting on a bus telling dirty jokes to their rabbi. Dee was telling this in their presence, and Dee was horrified that you would tell dirty jokes.
Who was like 6 years old.
Oh, and Aviva was there, 6-year-old Aviva. And to that point, I actually it jives nicely with this text, right? Like, if you went to meet the Dalai Lama, if you met, Mahatma Gandhi, if you walked across a bridge at Selma with Dr. Martin Luther King, if you had a rabbi who you read his book 100 times and it changed your life, and once you got to go to Shabbat services and see him give or her give a sermon, right? You would act differently. You would sit in their presence in a different light, right? And I personally don't want that kind of level of like Rebbe worship. I find it awkward. I'd rather be very down to earth. But the idea that you see someone who you regard as holy and you behave better is not a terrible thing, right? Be on your best behavior as a concept that your parents might introduce you to around a certain person is a good thing. Now, I would argue we should always be on our best behavior, but there is no doubt, there is no getting away from the fact that there are certain people in our lives where if we were around them, we would act differently and in a good way. And that's a good thing. And I'll spin it the other way, which is for us to be a good influence onto all the people that we come into contact with, where people say like, oh, Dee is a really special person and really kind and really humble and really thoughtful. And when I'm around Dee, I am compelled to be more kind, more humble, and more thoughtful. That is a good thing. So I would say there are ways. I know what Marilyn was going to say. I cut you off, Marilyn, but I'm spinning it in a way in which it could be better. And we'll see where this goes in a second. So the text ends with this line, Mihu zev ezehu, which is also, by the way, a song. Mihu zev ezehu. It's a thing we sing at Purim. I don't know the rest of the song. So there's been a lot of singing in this class, and for that, I apologize, everybody. Paula is.
It's taking me back to Rabbi Werba.
Paula's really upset. Paula's really upset. Paul is like, I'm not coming next week. Rabbi Goodman is singing way too much. All right. So mihu zeh ve'ezehu, which is this really fascinating line that stands out, and you'll see it tonight. And it's going to get us into that question I asked before about Ahazeras, right? Is Ahazeras a good guy? Are we to understand that he had this? Because when I was growing up, I always understood the story as what's called pshat, which is he's an idiot, right? And Haman manipulates him at the beginning of the story to do terrible things, and he's an idiot, and so he goes along. And at the end of the story, he finds out his wife is Jewish. And by the way, in case you're trying to figure out what is this mihu zeh ve'ezehu, where does this appear in the story? This is Book of Esther, chapter 7, verse 5. Line 4 and line 3 are the big reveal, right? It's where Esther throws a feast for the king, and Esther beckons the king into his bedroom and her bedroom, and said, and she reveals in great fear, there's been this decree to kill and exterminate and destroy all the Jews who are my people. And it's a terrible thing. And that's when Ahazeras says, and she says, one guy decided to do this, right? And the king's response is, mihu zeh ve'ezehu. He's furious. The king is, how dare someone attempt to murder my queen and all her people, right? And so my understanding of that is, he's a stooge. He's a schmuck. Like he's a schlemiel. Like when I was a kid, I always understood Ahasuerus to be a moron. And he suddenly gets wise at the end of this. Now, the rabbis are going to argue he's not a moron, right? That he actually is complicit in evil the whole time. And that's kind of where we're going to go. But the whole concept of mihu zeh ve'ezehu is it's this pivot moment in the story for those of us who believe he's a dupe, that he suddenly realizes that he's been duped. For others, there's another way of looking at it. All right. Tanya, will you read the bottom and then the beginning of the next paragraph after I scroll down? So it's and in truth. Unmute.
And in truth, Ahazeras was an enemy of the Jews, as our rabbis. And how do you say that?
It's an acronym for Zichronam Livracha, but you could say Zal.
Okay, Zal said, Megillah 14a. It is like the parable of the owner of the hill and ditch. See
Okay.
below.
Yeah, time out. So that's all that Rabbi Levi Yitzhak says. He just says it's like the parable in the Talmud of the hill and the ditch. Now, I've been a rabbi for 16 years. I'd never studied this text before, and it's fantastic. I'd never seen this before, and it's brilliant. So, Tanya, you're going to read this. You don't have to do the Hebrew. This is from Talmud Megillah 14a, and it is an amazing understanding of why Haman and Ahasuerus are both terrible. Go ahead, Tanya, read this first paragraph.
Okay, the actions of Ahazeras and Haman can be understood with a parable. To what may they be compared? To two individuals, one of whom had a mound in the middle of the field and the other of whom had a ditch in the middle of his field, each one suffering from his own predicament. The owner of the ditch, noticing the other's mound of dirt, said to himself, who will give me this mound of dirt suitable for filling in my ditch? I would even be willing to pay for it with money. And the owner of the mound, noticing the other's ditch, said to himself, who will give me this ditch for money, so that I may use it to remove the mound of earth from my property?
Isn't this a cute parable, right? Like two guys, they each have a field. One guy's got too much dirt and one guy's got a giant hole to fill, right? And they're both like, where do I find a guy who will fill this hole? Or where do I find a guy who will remove this pile of dirt and put it in a hole, right? So you'll see these guys are both, we're going to be understanding it as bad guys. But there's nothing wrong with the field owner in the parable. We just have to understand the idea of
him try to get the ditch.
Right.
I mean, he's going to pick it up and move it.
No, right. Well,
That's stupid to that one.
right. Well, Paul is going to complain about the nature of the parable being difficult, and that like somebody's got to move the dirt to the ditch, or the ditch to the.
You can't move the ditch to the.
Yeah, but we have to kind of suspend reality a little bit and basically acknowledge that Both these guys got a problem. One guy's got too much dirt, and one guy's got not enough dirt. All right, keep going, Tanya. You're going to read the big conclusion.
Okay, at a later point, one day, they happened to have met one another. The owner of the ditch said to the owner of the mound, "Sell me your mound so I can fill in my ditch." The mound's owner, anxious to rid himself of the excess dirt on his property, said to him, "Take it for free. If only you had done so sooner." Similarly, Ahazeras himself wanted to destroy the Jews, and he was delighted that Haman had similar aspirations and was willing to do the job for him. He demanded no money from him.
Okay, so in the parable, Ahasuerus is the sell me your mound guy, and Haman is the take it for free guy. And the parable is basically getting at what the rabbis in both the Talmud and in later in the medieval period believe about Ahasuerus. They read, and I'll explain why in a second, right? And I think you all know the answer because we've talked about it in this class before. And it's why I, as a historically minded conservative rabbi, forgive the Talmud its trespasses, right? Their read is Ahasuerus is an anti-Semite and an evil guy and not a dupe. And that he was, the only thing that he was surprised at was that the beautiful woman that he married happened to be Jewish. And whether he has a change of heart at the end or not, I don't know. But the rabbis understand Ahasuerus as bad as Haman, right? And that he was not a dupe, but complicit in and going along with intentionally the destruction of the Jewish people. And so he is the sell me your mound guy. And Haman says, why don't we solve your problem and my problem together? We both hate the Jews. I'd be happy to take part in killing them, and you take it for free, right? I don't need any money to do your dirty work. And so that's the rabbinic understanding of Ahasuerus. So now we're in the middle of, remember, go back a text to the beginning of Kedushat Levi. And Levi Yitzhak Berdichev is basically saying, Ahasuerus is terrible. But the framing of the original text is about standing in the presence of Esther and how it's related to the concept of the Arizal's idea that one becomes a better person when they stand in the presence of their Rav. Maybe you know where this is going. All right, let's keep going. Craig, do you mind reading down to, we'll go to where it says, are in their presence. So you'll just read this little paragraph right here.
There was nothing until now that Ahazeras ever spoke to Esther except through a translator, as our rabbi said. As such, everything that came out of his mouth was evil towards Israel. But now that he speaks to her face to face and not by a translator, it becomes kind words for Israel. For he was speaking directly to a Tzaddikus. He takes on thoughts which are of holiness in which to speak of Israel. For the bright light of the righteous shines upon all those that are in their presence.
All right. So the rabbis create a little thing in the Talmud where basically they presuppose that at every moment except this moment, Ahasuerus was speaking, I guess, Middle Farsi, and Esther only speaks Hebrew. Now, that's probably ridiculous in the sense that, like, of course, she was a Persian Jew. Of course, she spoke Middle Farsi, but whatever. We just suspend. They could have been, considering the time period, it might have been Pahlavi. Pahlavi was an ancient forerunner of Farsi. But the reality is, by the way, a lot of the rabbis, a lot of modern scholars believe that the entire idea of a Jewish people living off in Persia in this time was probably fanciful. There is no evidence that there were Jews in what the time period would have been around 400 before the Common Era had even made it to Persia in this time. So that's a whole nother argument of what was really happening in this time period. But the argument is basically being made, Ahasuerus never speaks to Esther face to face without a translator, except this once. And the way that Kedushat Levi is using that idea is to say, he could conspire to do evil behind her back. He could conversate with her through a translator and not know that she was Jewish and conspire to do evil. But the moment he is standing in her presence, one-on-one, speaking face-to-face, he stands in the presence of a tzedekah, of a righteous woman, from the Hebrew word tzaddik, right? And in the presence of a tzaddik, a person as holy as Esther, you can't do evil. You can't plot evil. You become a better person, right? When you're standing before your Rav on Shabbos and on Yontiv, you stand in the bright light of goodness, and you are impelled to do better, right? If you walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge with Dr. Martin Luther King, you would be transformed during the moment that you did it, and you would be transformed every minute afterwards for the rest of your life, right? If you stood by John Lewis, when he gave a great speech, you would be further permanently transformed by the experience, right? Righteous individuals who do good things impart their goodness upon us and compel us to do better things. I think, not to get political and homiletical, but I always do at this class. There was a great story on NPR the other day. It was talking about Vladimir Zelensky, and I did not know this. Vladimir Zelensky's approval rating before the war with Russia was 25%. Ukrainians did not like him. They did not think he was doing a good job. And here he is putting on a flak jacket, standing on the front lines and speaking out about the violence that's being done to his country. And his words are moving people's hearts and minds. And to stand in the presence of a person speaking righteousness is to be forever changed by their righteousness, right? And I think that's a really compelling thing to say. The way it's being framed here is interesting, and you could argue it, but I still think it's valuable, which is that Ahasuerus is incapable of speaking evil and doing evil in Esther's presence. When he stands in her presence, he becomes good. Even for the moment, he becomes good. So it's an interesting read on why Ahasuerus becomes really good. By the way, someone yesterday, my friend Esther over the weekend, pointed out that my English reading of that word, Ahasuerus, I grew up translating that or reading that in English as Ahasuerus. Paula says we all did. She grew up not Jewish, and she grew up hearing it as Ahasuerus. And I was like, Esther, what the hell is that? Which is why good rabbis generally say Achashverosh, which is the Hebrew, and then they don't have any problems. Okay, we're almost done with this text. It ends in this final paragraph, but first I'll call on Marilyn. Go ahead. Unmute.
Sorry, it wasn't clicking. I have a problem with this particular metaphor because to be perfect is not human. And the idea that suddenly being in Esther's presence makes him, at least for that moment, more perfect or perfect, in other words, in goodness. I have a big problem with the whole thing, to be honest, in this sense.
Sure.
that we must assume that in the presence of any rabbi, we're going to be made better by it. I don't buy that. I know that rabbis are human and sometimes they have bad days. Okay. Yep. And they're allowed to have bad days. To ask them to be always perfect is to ask them to not be human. And as a human, when I go to a rabbi for help, for direction, I want to know I'm talking to a human being who understands humanity. I have a whole problem with this whole construct.
Yep. I don't disagree with anything that you said. As a person who, I'm literally wearing my Wu-Tang t-shirt, which says Steel Army and Wu-Tang Clan is for the children. You know, my whole take and my whole book is all like about Hassidut is for the people. And Hassidut can only be for the people if the people they learn Hassidut from are humans, right? Believing that I'm some mystical guru, while it may sell more books, is probably not a thing that I believe in. Although I gotta say,
there's another side to this too. Esther waits a long time to speak up.
Right.
She's not
So-
perfect either, okay?
no, there's no doubt.
She's not perfect
One of the
either.
challenges
And
one of the challenges that the Hasidic rabbis, and it's the thing that I mentioned with my discomfort with the whole Esther story at the beginning, is one of the problems that the Hasidic rabbis and the Talmudic rabbis and the medieval rabbis all have to deal with is this story is a hot damn mess. It is just absolutely a moral train wreck, right? People are doing, and that's why when I read it as a farce, thinking of it as Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew or Midsummer Night's Dream is a lot easier than reading it as a historical factual thing that happened for me. Now, other Orthodox rabbis would immediately respond, that is, as they say in Hebrew, straight kafira. That is absolute heresy. For me to say the book of Esther is a fanciful, farcical story that never happened, other people would say, how dare you, Rabbi? You can't do that. But I have a really hard time with this text. The rabbis for thousands of years basically had to deal with the same problems. The story is a hot mess. Trying to figure out how to make even a shtickle, even a tiny bit of moral compass directing based on this biblical book, which is holy writ, is really difficult. I appreciate the mental backflips, right? Marilyn, I appreciate you. You've always been straight up, which is you say typically like having to do mental backflips in order to homogenize a story, it ain't your style and you don't like it. And I appreciate that. All right, Tanya, go ahead, ask your question, and then we got to wrap up.
Okay, just real quick, another thing that's problematic with the Esther story, when Haman approaches the king to tell him there is this people, and that's the way I've already read it. He doesn't even name the people, and the king doesn't even ask. And that's problematic for me because he never, well, in the Christian readings that I've read, it never says the Jews, he just says a people.
Yeah. Hitler was at least respectful enough of the Jewish people to say we were the cause of all the problems in the world and we needed to be exterminated. But if somebody else had said, and I'm being flip and light, but we're talking about Hitler, may his name be erased and may he rot forever in hell. So I hope that's okay that I clarify that. But Ahazeras can't even give us or Haman can't even give us the respect of naming him. And Ahazeras is such a dupe here that one of his grand advisors says like, hey, you got some trouble in your kingdom with this group of people. And Ahazeras says, I don't need to even know. Just go get rid of them. Like I got things to do, man. I have a tea time at 9 a.m. I can't be bothered with specific details like, uh-oh. Are you guys still there or did I freeze? Oh no, my phone crashed and now the class is going to crash. There's going to be no more class. It's just going to end abruptly. So, because my phone is out of power, isn't it? And that's what happens when there's no Wi-Fi in the building.